Okay, well, I am really excited today. Actually, got less sleep last night because of it. But I'm really excited today to be talking about the biology of this stuff. So get that better focus there. The biology about this stuff. So that the folks that are not really inclined to believe the electromagnetic theories that I've presented, this is going to kind of come along a little bit more tangible space and talk about the biology. One of the things that I've found to be true is that one of the ways that they keep just the average everyday people like you and me from understanding this stuff is the terminology that's used is so complex. The words, the names of things. I mean, if you try and hold a conversation with a neurologist, you know, someone who works with the brain and maybe does surgery on the brain and so forth, I mean, they have a vocabulary and language inside of them that you could never touch as an everyday person, because you have to go through a decade of schooling to acquire that. And so it's kind of interesting, but it's a similar separation and kind of we know and you don't that was so true back in the early days of the church, when everything was kept in the Latin language and in a language that the people couldn't understand. And so having a spiritual language that people don't understand, keep them compressed and in control spiritually, okay? And having a medical language that people don't understand compresses them and limits them medically for what they could do. Because a person who has brain cancer, the average everyday person, they are completely at the mercy of these white lab coat doctors, because what does the average everyday person know about brain neurology or all these giant words and stuff that they have? They don't know. And so what I'm trying to do is empower people so that they don't feel like they can't participate in the decisions and actions that are taking place in their own life. You know, because they meaning can't participate in the sense of having a feeling that they're really contributing to the most logical decision, because they don't understand the situation at all. So they don't have any discernment that they can contribute. So again, you're just left at the mercy of the hospital, of the Western treatment to which you're subjecting yourself. So by hopefully giving some biology here, we can begin to bridge that gap. Now, yesterday when I mentioned that hallucinogenic drugs are fuel for the brain, I wasn't saying, and this needs to be clear, I wasn't saying that everyone should be doing hallucinogenic drugs and that it's a normal everyday thing that everyone should be doing all the time. I'm not saying that. They are medications. When we talk about fuels for the brain, I mentioned hallucinogenic drugs are a fuel. Another fuel for the brain, I mentioned that yesterday. Another fuel for the brain is these essential oils that like Young Living makes. And I mean, even they're even a solvent, if you notice. Because they're solvents, you can easily consider them to be a fuel, a biological fuel. And if we're going to heal the brain through natural methodology, we have to use organic fuels which the body can readily metabolize and utilize without a bunch of inflammation, meaning side effects. Side effects are basically neurological inflammation or psychological inflammation, and obviously the biological inflammation in the body from taking something that poisons your liver and your kidneys and your colon. And so you need to utilize fuels which don't poison your liver, your colon, and your kidneys and so forth. You need to use fuels that are adaptive, not maladaptive, but adaptive, readily adaptive to the body, because they're sourced from nature. Okay. Now, these fuels from nature contain compounds, healing compounds. And one of the healing compounds they contain, just off the top of my head, is sesquiterpenes. Okay? Sesquiterpenes are organic compounds made by plants that cannot be synthesized in a lab. And sesquiterpenes are medical miracles, basically. plant medical miracles. They oxygenate the blood. They cleanse the blood. They're anti-inflammatory. They're anti-spastic. Sesquiterpenes also can actually rebuild the DNA. One of the major, or one of the reasons why you get cancer, one of the reasons why there is cancer, is that the cell's DNA becomes compromised. And sesquiterpenes, when they're ingested, can go in and actually rebuild the crystalline structure that is the DNA. And this is a tool. When I talk about giving your body organic tools, this is one of the tools that the Western disciplines won't provide to you, that plants do provide to you, that actually heal you. Okay? Now, nature is full of these fuels, and if you just look at the lineup that that Young Living has as far as oils that they offer, you'll notice that there are hundreds of fuels, super fuels, that are readily available to you, and all you have to do is ingest them, apply them, whatever it takes to get it in your body, and they will do their thing. The body knows how to heal itself. It knows exactly how to heal itself, and so all you have to do is tool it to do that. And so in these videos, what I'm working to do is to provide to you logical tools with substance as to the reasoning behind I'm suggesting those tools. And so I'm opening this with a simple consideration with sesquiterpenes. Now, when we get into really serious brain dysfunctions, trauma disorders, anxiety disorders, disorders that you are born with, and these psychological and neurological disorders are the real bugbears when it comes to healing in the West. And that's why such strong and powerful medicines have to be used, like ayahuasca, like magic mushrooms, like cannabis. That's why those really strong hallucinogenic compounds have to be used, because these neurological cognitive dysfunctions are extremely complicated. And any brain neurologist will tell you, any honest brain neurologist will tell you that they understand very, very little about the brain. They really don't understand much. It's very difficult to address and truly heal these dysfunctions because they're so complicated. And when you try and address them reductionistically, as I've mentioned, you're only going to be able to go after one or two aspects. I read up the other night on, I think it was Zoloft, how it binds, and it's an agonist for the dopamine and serotonin systems. And fine, it does that, but there's a whole host of watchdog systems, of balancing and harmonic systems that are present in the brain and the limbic system for guiding and maintaining and balancing the emotional status and seat of the person. And therefore, when you just go in and are just addressing serotonin and just addressing dopamine and not all the other neurochemistry and the hundreds of compounds that are also interacting, this is how you put dysfunction into the body when trying to do the right thing. It's like the story of the little girl that loved the little bunny rabbit so much on the way home from the pet store that she squeezed it to death. And this is just, she loved that little bunny so much, but didn't realize that what she was doing was actually harming the body, or the bunny. And that's exactly what's happening so much with these psychological disturbances that people are addressing, and that they think they're doing the right thing because they're going to this psychiatrist and they're going to these white lab coat doctors that are advising them, and they think they're doing the right thing when actually they're actually putting harm into their body without realizing it. Because you're addressing a complicated problem from just this consciousness perspective, this obsession with consciousness and waking consciousness that science and these doctors are obsessed with, when there's this whole subconscious side, which is actually a larger pool and which actually has a greater contribution to the dysfunction, meaning that it needs healing. So in order to heal psychologically, you have to address appropriately the subconscious. And none of the medications that are available to you in the West address the subconscious. They completely ignore it because they are based in reductionism, and reductionism has no time for any kind of situation that isn't cognitive, that can't be mapped, measured, patterned, and repeated. And so a reductionistic approach to brain dysfunction will never work, looking at it with these logical steps that I've just provided. Okay, now, when you take a holistic medicine, meaning a medicine made by a plant, and you just simply extract that medicine with all the beautiful compounds that are associated with it, or you don't even need to extract, you just eat it, like in the case of psilocybin mushrooms. When you ingest these plant medicines, the whole entourage, the whole ensemble of healing constituents and compounds are released into the body. Now what happens? Let's just take a gander at what happens when you eat psilocybin mushrooms. Now, your body has inside of it what's called the blood-brain barrier. And this barrier is the pharmacological barrier which the body uses to, it's like a border check. It keeps what it doesn't want to get into the brain from getting into the brain. It's a barrier. And if you're going to get any medicine into, or I should say past, the blood-brain barrier, you have to have a compound that the body will understand what it is, and it will allow it freely into the brain to do its thing. So how, for example, how does this happen in the colon and the stomach, biologically? Okay, here we go. When you ingest psilocybin mushrooms, they contain two specific compounds within the whole entourage of compounds that are in them. They contain two compounds, namely psilocybin and psilocin. Okay? Psilocybin doesn't pass the blood-brain barrier, but psilocin does. So when you eat the mushroom, your body does what is called dephosphorylates the psilocybin into psilocin. And this is just a fancy scientific word to say that the phosphorus atom of the psilocybin compound is metabolized by the body. In other words, it's not on the compound anymore, and the compound now is different because it doesn't have that phosphorus atom on it. And without that phosphorus on it, it turns into psilocin. Well, turning it into psilocin will allow it to pass the blood-brain barrier. And so when you eat psilocybin mushrooms, they're dephosphorylated into psilocin, and then that psilocin passes the blood-brain barrier and goes into the brain. Now here's where the magic happens, okay? Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that your body utilizes for your brain to be able to communicate with itself. Think of it like oil for an engine. If an engine didn't have oil in it, it will seize. It won't work anymore. If your brain is deficient in its serotonin, dysfunction happens, just like dysfunction will happen when you take the oil out of an engine. And dysfunction in the brain manifests, serotonin dysfunction in the brain manifests as psychological disequilibrium. And what you're trying to do when you have a dysfunction is realize equilibrium. That's why cannabis is so important, because it equalizes the autonomic nervous system, the neurological balancing mechanism in the body. Okay? Psilocybin, on the other hand, addresses a different set of organs and a different set of mechanisms, and I'm sorry to use a mechanical word, but a different set of mechanisms, organic mechanisms, in the brain to heal it. Now, how does it do it? Folks, this took me so long to get this information because it's so hard to find. What it does is, psilocin is a mimic, is in its compound spin resonance, structure, and form, it's a mimic to serotonin. And when psilocin enters into the blood, enters into the brain in mass, namely when you eat psilocybin mushrooms, the brain thinks it has just been flooded with serotonin, a natural compound that your body makes constantly. And so when the gut, where serotonin is originated, when the gut generates psilocin, it floods the brain with psilocin. The brain mistakes that with serotonin, and all of the neurons in the brain begin to activate. This is just like a call from organic nature, announcing to these neurons in the head, hey, wake up, let's get to action, let's get to work. And because you don't have all these side effects impinging on the person, you don't have all this inflammation that keeps them from healing. Side effects keep you from healing because there's psychological inflammation and physiological inflammation. And inflammation stops flow, stops healing. And what we're trying to do is generate healing, generate flow, remove the charged pathways by metabolizing them away and smoothing out the brain. And by smoothing out, you remove those hot spots, you remove those asleep spots, and you generate equilibrium. Okay. When you look at a neuron, it looks like if you were to, like, have you ever seen an octopus? And an octopus, when it's about to like push, like an octopus doesn't have fins, has all these tendrils and this membrane, and the legs open up, and it like opens up like this, and then they pinch together, and that pinching together pushes, accelerates the octopus through the water. Imagine when the octopus has all its tendrils fully open. That is exactly what a neuron looks like. It's got a core in its center, and then it's got these tendrils, these arms that come off of it. And those arms are communicating tendrils, just like fingers on your hand that communicate to your brain that you're feeling something. And these tendrils are the way that the neurons communicate with the other neurons. And what you're wanting to do is for there to be flow in the brain. And remember how I talked about how you have these charged pathways that form when you get addictions, when you're addicted to something? Those disrupt the flow of the brain. And they're like a lake, and the water is draining into the lake and pooling there and sitting there. And that's a really good metaphor for what happens when the brain is in a state of dysfunction. There are areas of stagnancy, and there are areas of overactivity. And so the cells, the neurons, as they're all trying to communicate with each other, which is what you want to make sure that there aren't hot spots, there aren't charged pathways, there aren't areas in the brain where there's overstimulation, and there aren't areas in the brain where there's understimulation. Neurons are a lot like a lot of people, where you can generate activity when you're around people. Like if you get in front of a crowd of people and you start, going nuts and doing all kinds of stuff, you can generate energy in the group. And like when you go to Hollywood and go to a game show, they have people that come out and tell jokes and get everybody all laughing and excited and stuff, so that when the host comes out and the game show starts, everybody's all excited and laughing and all that stuff. They're already responsive. That's what you're trying to do when you heal the brain. You're trying to generate activity, and you're trying to calm the people or calm the neurons that are overfiring and going crazy, like when you have addiction, like when you have a trauma bond situation where you had too much stimulation in an area and it's in a state of dysfunction. Okay. What you're doing then when you ingest all of this psilocybin that turns into psilocin is that compound, that psilocin, that the body thinks is serotonin, the body readily metabolizes it and begins to integrate all of that psilocin into the neurons just as though it was serotonin. And when the neurons begin to metabolize the serotonin or the psilocin, and the psilocin is bound to the synapse in the brain, when that psilocin is placed into that gap, communication begins to happen. Those tendrils that are coming off of the cells, okay, that are coming out of the neurons, they don't touch each other, but they almost touch, and the area that they almost touch is called the synapse. This is all at the microscopic level. And there's a gap. It's called the synaptic gap. And the gap between the tendrils, that synapse is where the communication happens. And serotonin, psilocin, those two neurocompounds are the catalyst to communication within the synapse. What you're trying to do then, in doing this, is get these neurons to talk to each other, so that the ones that are angry and going nuts will calm down, and the ones that are asleep and lethargic will awaken, and the ones that are operating normally will just keep doing their thing. No negative side effects. That's what we're looking for here. We're looking for a medicine that doesn't introject inflammation into the brain. And when you take these pharma drugs made in a lab, not from nature, synthesized by man, synthesized by consciousness, when you do that, you are not providing a fuel that the body can readily metabolize. You're providing a fuel that's going to cause inflammation, side effects, poisoning. And that's why long-term prognosis using these laboratory synthesized man-made drugs are so poor. That's why. And like I said when I started, if you've got doctors that readily admit that they don't know or understand most of the very organ that they are attempting to address, and they are attempting to put medication into, it's like going to a person who has been trained to repair bicycles and bringing them a hybrid F1 Ferrari and saying, please fix all the aerodynamics on this car and make the aerodynamic balance of the car accurate and appropriate. He'll never be able to. She'll never be able to. Because they do not understand the fundamentals of the very system that they are attempting to address. And the exact same principle applies to every single neurological doctor that exists that is subscribing medication to people. They are attempting to repair and address and advise a person that has a system of which they admittedly have no freaking idea how it actually does what it does. They don't even know what the cytoplasm does inside the cell. The very plasma, the goo inside the cell that makes the actual cell work. They don't even know what motivates that. We're talking the most basic biology that is absent, an understanding of biology that is absent from the systems that are attempting to address human dysfunction. And so because everyone is under this illusion, okay, there is a madness now. And that madness is manifesting in these psychological dysfunctions that we see everywhere. With people that believe in white supremacy, right? That's dysfunction. With people that believe that being gay is a sin, or being gay is somehow something wrong with you, okay? That's a psychological dysfunction. Thinking that males are somehow greater or more powerful than females. That's craziness. That's madness. And so we have permeating through our culture all kinds of psychological dysfunction, because everything that we're doing is based on enterprises which don't understand the very biological basics of what's happening. So it sounds like Looney Tunes when I come into the situation and start saying that hallucinogenic drugs provide an answer. I sound like a total madman saying something like that, because everyone is living in a simulacrum. A simulacrum which says, hey, these brain neurologists, hey, they know what they're doing. These guys know what they're doing. These gals know what they're doing. And they're so smart when they prescribe SSRIs. They're so brilliant when they prescribe these drugs that are poisoning the liver, poisoning the colon. They're so smart when they're engaging in chemotherapy, which hasn't worked for 70 years, and they just keep pumping it, thinking that it's going to do something different. This is why it's so important to not be afraid, of hallucinogenic drugs, of that word that I just said, to not be afraid of these things, to not be afraid when I suggest therapies that reject medical principles, to not be afraid, because you are living in a misunderstanding. You are living under maladaptive terms and methodologies which don't heal. And you're under the illusion that they do. Every night when you dream, your brain generates a neurochemical called dimethyltryptamine. Dimethyltryptamine is a chemical constituent that is ubiquitous with organic nature. Almost every plant on this planet has DMT in it. Almost every living organism has DMT in it. What's really interesting is DMT is considered a Schedule I drug, okay? You make DMT every night in your brain, and DMT is considered a Schedule I drug, and you could be arrested and put in prison for life for possessing or using DMT. And it's a compound that you make all the time in your brain. It tells you the lunacy we're living under here. Now, DMT facilitates the dream state. And this is real important. Now, what have I been saying consistently? When it comes to medications for the brain, they must be holistic, meaning they must address the consciousness and they must address the unconsciousness. Well, psilocybin is a mimic for DMT. Ayahuasca has DMT directly in it. And DMT will help facilitate psychological healing. How? Great question. It will facilitate psychological healing because it opens the door to the unconscious. And it is in the unconscious, just like Jung said, just like Freud said, it is in the unconscious where all of our pain, trauma, turmoil rests. And if we are ever going to heal, we must address the subconscious. We must address that which is within us. Whoops. That which is within us that is causing us dysfunction, that's causing us harm and pain. Okay. Because DMT can unlock and freely open the subconscious, when you walk into a space consciously with your subconscious accessible, you then can do some serious psychological work. Because your consciousness is allowed access, is allowed past the subconscious barrier to walk into the subconscious and to begin to look around and to begin to see things objectively, building discernment. And when a person is able to walk into their unconscious state consciously and observe it and feel the pain and feel what's going on and observe all this stuff without having to address all this conscious anxiety that they always have when they're in their conscious mind, enormous strides are made. And you can begin to heal and find out why. Oh, that's why it's so hard for me to love another male or female figure. Because in my past, I was abused or under stress or whatever by the same gendered figure. So if I was abused by my mother, as I grow up, I'm going to have issues with females because I've got all this psychological baggage that has been generated from the pain and torment that I suffered under the abuse of my mom. Let's say if I was a person that was abused by their mom. And so a person will go into a counselor's office for years and years and years because it's so hard to break past that psychological membrane into the unconscious. And these plant medicines readily allow for that. They readily facilitate that. And so, like what the MAPS Foundation is doing, when they introduce a psychedelic drug into a patient, that patient can be in the experience sitting on the psychological couch with the counselor, and they're able to navigate this subconscious space with the counselor there, this wise counselor with them, to begin to help them break apart these dysfunctions that are causing them to behave inappropriately. And enormous strides can be made. That's why you've seen in some of those quotes from people that have ingested ibogaine, that have been addicted to heroin for years, are able to overcome the addiction in 48 hours. That's the reason why. Because they are able to make psychological strides which would have taken them literally years and years and years of daily hard work to overcome, or to realize, or to metabolize, whatever way you want to put it. And so this is why these medicines are so incredibly effective, because they allow a tool for either the individual by themselves, or the individual, if they feel more comfortable having someone with them, a sitter with them. They provide a tool, a super ultra powerful psychological tool, that will allow them to cognitively, responsibly, and through the path of the heart, through the path of compassion, be able to address all this hate, all this pain, all this anger that they have inside. Because love is what can quench that. Love is what can quench all anger, all pain. And when a person can love themselves, in other words, knowing who they are, knowing these aspects about themselves, and then resolving them and loving them because they are beginning to build an understanding of themselves and love for themselves, these things provide that tool. And by providing that, you provide a catalyst, real psychological, biological tools that actually can do the job that's needed. That's extremely difficult to do, because it's almost impossible to break into these psychological shells that our psyche builds to protect us when we're little, and we don't know how to work through this stuff. So what happens is, when you're little, is the psyche builds these shells that protect it. And those shells cause dysfunction because they stop flow. And what you're wanting in the brain is flow. What you're wanting to heal autism is flow. Alzheimer's is flow. Mental retardation is flow. And the only way you're going to generate flow is with holistic medicines that don't perturbate one or two chemical compounds in the medicine, in the brain, but actually perturbate the whole brain, all of the compounds. Naturally, with plants that we have been ingesting for millennia here as human beings, that our body knows how to readily metabolize. So this is how you logically address and compassionately and appropriately address neurological dysfunction, through knowing and understanding some basics like I've shared with you, and then knowing and understanding some basics about medicines that are available, and then appropriately, in the correct set and setting, applying these things that you've now come into an understanding of, not frivolously. And so it's so important to understand the dynamics, the psychological dynamics associated with these hallucinogenic drugs, so that you don't abuse them and use them appropriately. Okay, so you've heard people say the term tripping. Okay, you've heard a person say, or you've heard the term, when people are on psychedelic drugs, that they go on a trip. The reason why they use the term trip is because the experience of the drug feels like it's taking you to some other place. It's taking you to another psychological orientation. And it feels like you have been transported to another space, another dimension, which you have. And it's a healing dimension. It's a dimension that's going to allow you to do psychological work. And the reason why it's so confounding is because, like I just mentioned, the whole brain has been turned on to activity through this psilocin that has entered the brain, or in the case of ayahuasca, the DMT. And there's an overwhelming feeling that happens because you are taken, you are consumed by all of this hidden information this hidden pain, this hidden anxiety, this hidden reasoning that's locked within you. It's down deep within you. And the shell, which psilocin so effectively can remove, and DMT and so forth, the shells that have been built, the psychological shells that have been built in the brain by the brain, automatically dissolve. This is when Terence McKenna would say it dissolves, psilocybin or psychedelics dissolve boundary structures. That's what he's talking about. The structures or the boundaries which psychologically build in the individual, even when they don't have a physiological disease. You can have boundaries from just your indoctrination, whether it's spiritually or cognitively or relationally, whatever. The way you were raised, those are building shells of psychology. Sometimes good, sometimes, most times negative. And those shells of psychology are addressed, are dissolved in the trip, and a person is allowed access into these spaces which at just a few hours before were hardened over by this psychological protective shell. And since a person can love themselves more than anyone else can love them, this person goes into this space, and because all of these boundaries have been dissolved, their typical response systems, which they normally engaged when confronted with the hard reality of pain and anxiety, they're lessened. They're replaced with a different type of approach, one that's more centered in the heart and love, rather than centered in kind of this third chakra idea, this projection of power. It's really the integration of one's power that they already have within. And it's the integration of that into the consciousness so that a person can objectively and with discernment begin to appropriately address this anxiety, this stress, this pain, this trauma that's been locked underneath these shells. And that's why the medicine is so profound. It's like a panacea when it comes to psychology, because it really allows a maturity to exist in the healing space, because the aspects which make you immature, the reactive responding, the shells, the projection, this is all lessened, and a more heart-centered response, a more heart-centered activity begins to be integrated and take place. I hope that makes sense.